Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Connor Mercer, and this is Connor Collects. I discuss a brief history of gaming, my thoughts on said history, and my experiences collecting video games. Today, we'll be talking about Nintendo, their role in resurrecting the American video game market, and how things operated afterwards and beyond. The year is 1985. What was once a vibrant ecosystem of pixel graphics and nerd paradise is now a desolate wasteland. Game companies scrounge for scraps, broke as a school clock. Gamers relish in the inexpensive prices, yet mourn the loss of new entertainment. It has been 2 years since the North American video game crash, and many doubt the longevity of the format. Meanwhile, in Japan, things have never looked better for scrappy underdog Nintendo. They've had their fair share of hits between the introduction of the Game & Watch line of handheld games in 1980 and the unexpected success of 1981's Donkey Kong. But their greatest success came in 1983 with the Famicom. The Famicom was, in many ways, just like the Atari of old. It used proprietary cartridges to store games, many of which were arcade ports. Yet, in just as many ways, the Famicom was different. Better, even. The Famicom used the chipset, basically the guts and brains, of the Donkey Kong arcade machine. This achieved several things. A, it made porting their existing arcade library fairly straightforward. B, essentially guaranteed that any Nintendo ports would run just as good as the arcade versions. And C, saved a large amount of money in the production of the console, as most of the hardware already existed. The Famicom, however, was exclusive to Japan, and Nintendo knew if they wanted to claim the fallen American empire, they had to play it smart. Initially, Nintendo wanted Atari themselves to do the hard work for them. Atari would market the Japanese Famicom as the American Nintendo Enhanced Video System and send Nintendo a chunk of the profit. However, there was one snag. Atari got cold feet. Atari and Nintendo were set to literally sign the deal in 1983 during the Consumer Electronics Show. However, Atari noticed that Coleco was demonstrating its new computer, the Atom, using a port of Donkey Kong. Atari erroneously believed that Nintendo had violated an earlier agreement to give them exclusive rights to Nintendo computer ports. What actually happened was that Coleco was demonstrating the Atom's compatibility with existing ColecoVision cartridges. Essentially, Atari falsely believed that Nintendo had broken an earlier contract and refused to sign the new one. Nintendo and Atari had cleared up the issue after about a month, but by then it was too late. The crash had already begun to take its toll, and Atari was facing severe financial hardship. Nintendo's planned release date came and went, and Atari couldn't do it. Nintendo was on their own. Hindsight is an interesting thing. Some mistakes seem so obvious in hindsight, but you rarely have it until it's too late. Nintendo had hindsight and good timing. As they watched the market crash unfold in real time, they pieced together a plan of attack. Do the opposite of everything that everyone else has already done. Nintendo would market the Famicom as a toy and sell it in toy stores. Boxes would feature actual graphics, so would-be buyers knew what they were getting into. Developer kits were only sent to Nintendo-approved studios. Lastly, the Nintendo Entertainment System featured a heavy rebranding. It looked and operated like a VHS player. Game cartridges went in the front, not the top, so that audiences wouldn't associate it with the video games. They even referred to the cartridges as game packs, a branding they used until the mid-2000s. While Nintendo's American branch worked on the American Famicom, Nintendo's home base wanted a great first impression. Sure, people loved Donkey Kong and Mario Bros., but Nintendo needed to keep making quality arcade games to get prospective gamers in the know. To do this, they made a standardized arcade hardware format in 1984 called the Nintendo Versus System, which was essentially a Famicom in an arcade cabinet. Many games that would be featured on the upcoming Nintendo Entertainment System would be introduced in arcades using near-exact perfect ports on the Versus hardware. The Nintendo Versus System continued use as Nintendo's default arcade format until 1990. There was one last trick up Nintendo's sleeve: convince people the Nintendo Entertainment System was a toy. Bundled with every NES or NES was the robotic operating buddy and a gun. In all seriousness, Nintendo used their fancy robot and their cool television light zapper to convince 10-year-olds across the nation that the new Nintendo was a cool toy. You could have Rob the robot grab spinning gyros with his robotic claws, or you could go for a duck hunt with your zapper. As Nintendo of America finalized the details, Nintendo of Japan finished their masterpiece, 1985's Super Mario Bros. Two of Nintendo's best and brightest, Shigeru Miyamoto and Takashi Tezuka, headlined the development team. A special team of designers and programmers aided the duo in what could be described as a final exam. All of these gentlemen were the best of the best, each having worked on several games for Nintendo, and here they were working together to make the game to end all games. I can't undersell just how big of a deal Super Mario Bros. Was, and that's before we even get to sales numbers and pop culture influence. This game perfected everything. The level design, the physics, the music, the art, you name it, were all handcrafted to be as stunning and fun as possible. Everything came together perfectly. Nintendo of America was about to go all in on the new NES console's launch, and Nintendo of Japan had just finished their masterpiece, just in time. On October 18, 1985, New York City was the first city in America to get the brand new, shockingly unique Nintendo Entertainment System. It was a 1-2 punch. Rob the Robot was the 1 and Mario was the 2. Kids bought the NES for Rob and stayed for the unparalleled quality of the brand new games, almost the same as the arcades. It was the first time anyone truly had the experience of the arcades in their own homes. Nintendo had kick-started the American game market back into high gear. Nothing like this on this scale had ever been achieved. Imagine injecting a gallon of caffeine directly into your veins. Competitors, old and new, wanted a piece of the pie. Atari limped back from the brink of collapse with the Atari 7800 console, which saw extremely modest success. New kid on the block Sega released their Sega Master System, which also saw modest success. Nothing quite lived up to the Nintendo experience, however, and in almost no time at all, Nintendo had taken over the world. Nintendo sold more entertainment systems in 1 year than the Commodore 64 sold in 5. Year after year, Nintendo shot out hit after hit. Super Mario Bros. 2, Zelda, Metroid, you name it, we got it. Nintendo wasn't the only studio making NES games, however. Nintendo allowed third-party developers to make and sell their own games under a few conditions. Nintendo required third-party studios to go directly to them for pretty much everything. They were not allowed to manufacture their own cartridges. They had to order a certain amount of cartridges from Nintendo themselves. They were only allowed to publish up to 5 games a year. They were not allowed to make games for other consoles. Additionally, Nintendo was very strict about their content policy, something that gained them favor with parents and fervor with studios. Atari was one of these studios. Shockingly, Atari had never fully recovered from the market crash, who could have guessed, and wanted a piece of the Nintendo pie. While they made games for their slowly dying 7800, they founded a studio called Tengen and attempted to get a license to make games for the Nintendo. Tengen begrudgingly agreed to Nintendo's strict policies while they worked on a loophole. Every Nintendo Entertainment System has a small chip inside that checks to see if a game inserted is in fact Nintendo approved. This lockout chip looked for a similar chip inside the cartridge. If they matched, the game would boot. If no such chip existed inside the game cartridge, the console refused to work. Tengen desperately wanted to make their own version of this chip so they could sell their own games without Nintendo over their shoulders. A later legal case would find that this act itself is perfectly legal, as long as it is done via reverse engineering. Tengen could not successfully reverse engineer the chip and actually got it by lying to the government. Tengen went to the United States Patent and Trademark Office and asked for a copy of the patent. Like a cartoon villain, some idiot at Tengen waltzed into the office, claimed they needed it for a legal case, and were immediately sued by Nintendo. Video game historians generally agree that Tengen would have been fine making their own chip had they not, and I quote, committed fraud. Legal issues aside, Nintendo was doing pretty good. In Japan, they released the short-lived Famicom Disk System, which allowed games to be run off of floppy disks. There were a few benefits over the old cartridge format, namely more storage, cheaper manufacturing costs, and the ability for the player to save their game progress. Fairly quickly, the floppy disk was made obsolete by improvements to cartridge design, such as more storage, cheaper manufacturing costs, and the addition of the 20-year battery, which, you guessed it, granted the ability for the player to save their game progress. The disk system never made its way to America, but most of the games did on cartridge. Nintendo seemed unstoppable for a while until new kid on the block Sega started ramping up advertising for its upcoming Genesis console. More advanced in every way, the Genesis threat finally forced Nintendo to begin development of a successor console. The Genesis was the edgy, cool console. It featured a cocky blue Quickster Hedgehog and so-called blast processing, and pretty much blew the Nintendo Entertainment System out of the water almost immediately. Not one to pass up a fight, Nintendo got to work on the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, which would release in 1990 in Japan and 1991 in America. While Nintendo of Japan worked on the new console, however, the company decided that the NES should go out with a bang. Once again, Nintendo's best and brightest got to work on one last masterpiece, Super Mario Bros. 3. Level design was refined, music was scored, marketing was done. By God, marketing was done. Nintendo spent $25 million on marketing for the game, including loaning it to Universal Studios for a starring appearance in 1989's The Wizard, a movie about a ragtag group of kids trying to get to California to win a video game tournament. To give you an idea of just how crazy Nintendo went with marketing, they spent $800,000 just making the game itself. $800,000 to make the game and $25 million to market it. Obviously, Super Mario Bros. 3 was a smashing success and a thrilling last dance for the Nintendo Entertainment System. Fun fact, because of chip shortages, the game was released 2 years apart, 1988 in Japan and 1990 in America. Despite the early lead of the Sega Genesis into what is now known as the fourth generation of video games, Nintendo went all in with the SNES, or SNES, and thus began an intense console war. The Sega Genesis was Nintendo's first true competitor. Sure, they'd fought against the Sega Master System and the Atari 7800, but they didn't exactly put up a fight. The Genesis was a genuine threat to Nintendo dominance in the industry. The Super Nintendo and the Genesis were comparable in hardware specs, so it all came down to the games. Nintendo brought back their old classic franchises, bringing sequels to Mario, Zelda, and Metroid, as well as introducing new beloved franchises such as Star Fox and F-Zero. Sega went all in too. Early on, Sega management wanted a mascot to compete with Mario, and a small internal studio got to work on Sonic the Hedgehog, a Genesis classic that took the world by storm almost as much as Mario did. Sega had a few aces up their sleeve. Sega was less strict with third-party developers, leading to many studios abandoning Nintendo entirely to work for the Genesis. Additionally, Sega's edgy and cool attitudes led to less censorship. Coupled with their marketing strategy, the Genesis was seen as the cool system. Kids wanted the Genesis simply because, in their eyes, all the cool kids had it. A breaking point in the console war was the release of arcade classic Mortal Kombat in 1992. By 93, both Nintendo and Sega were clamoring to have ports, and soon they had their wish. However, the gory, violent brawler seen in the arcades was sanitized to instead be bruisey and sweaty. Although, the Sega version had a hidden cheat code that brought back the blood and guts. Once word got out on the school playground, sales for the Sega port skyrocketed. Have you ever heard of Murphy's Law? Anything that can go wrong will go wrong. In 1993, the United States government organized congressional hearings discussing the use of violence in video games. Sega started to sweat. Ultimately, there were no real consequences of these hearings, although for a brief moment it seemed like all was lost. Senator Joe Lieberman threatened strict regulations on video games unless the industry could self-regulate. Nintendo and Sega had no choice but to come together and invent a solution. Sega proposed an industry-wide use of their rating system, which marked Sega games as for everybody, for teenagers, or for adults. Nintendo refused to use Sega's system as they believed it would look bad using their competitors' ratings on their own games. Soon, a similar, albeit generic, system was created. Games would be rated by a non-biased organization called the Entertainment Software Rating Board, founded by Nintendo and Sega as well as third-party developers such as Acclaim and Electronic Arts. With self-regulation in active service, the government stood down and all was well with the world. As the fourth generation began to wind down, the brand new compact disc format was gaining popularity. Sega released the Sega CD add-on for the Genesis, which allowed games to be ran off of CDs. Nintendo teamed up with electronics company Sony to make a CD add-on for the SNES, but the deal fell through and Sony decided to go their own way. Remember this. Meanwhile, Sega was increasingly infighting between its Japanese and American departments. This infighting led to several pieces of hardware being launched in rapid succession, such as the failed 32X add-on, which gave the Genesis 3D graphics, the failed Sega Nomad, which was a handheld device that played Genesis cartridges, and the not quite a failure Sega Saturn, the Genesis successor that got curb-stomped in the fifth generation. Ah yes, the fifth generation of video game consoles, the mainstream introduction of 3D graphics, the death of Atari, the introduction of, drumroll please, Sony's brand new PlayStation. Using their previous expertise gained with their brief stint with Nintendo, Sony began working on an inexpensive console that would change the course of history forever. The Sony PlayStation, released in 1995, was a success unseen since the original Nintendo Entertainment System. The PlayStation literally flew off shelves, and both Nintendo and Sega were shook. Atari gave its last breath with the comically underpowered Atari Jaguar. The Jaguar was released in 1993 and bled the company dry by 1996. Atari was bought out by Hasbro in 1998, and the modern Atari is an entirely different company, with its only connection being branding. Atari was no more. Sega gave up on the Sega Saturn fairly quickly and began work on yet another successor. Nintendo, on the other hand, were biding their time. Late to the party for the second time in a row, Nintendo released the groundbreaking Nintendo 64 in 1996. You may have noticed several of these consoles have numbers for names: the Sega 32X, the Nintendo 64, the honorable mention TurboGrafx 16, which briefly fought against the SNES and Genesis. Unlike the Commodore 64, all of these consoles were named after their bit count. What is a bit? Most people didn't actually know, but it has something to do with how a CPU processes data. Most people generally agreed, with varying degrees of truth, that more bits meant more power. Atari got a lot of flack for claiming their Jaguar, which had two 32-bit processors, was 64 bits. The Nintendo 64 was a powerful 64-bit console that introduced the 3D analog controller. By all accounts, it should have blown the PlayStation out of the water. There was one fatal flaw that prevented this: the cartridge. The Saturn and the PlayStation both used CDs. In exchange for painfully long loading screens, you got almost a gigabyte of data and cheaper manufacturing costs. A cartridge could hold up to 64 megabytes of data and cost way more to produce than a single disc. For reference, 1,000 megabytes is a single gigabyte, and a CD could hold 700 megabytes. Games could be bigger on the PlayStation, even if the Nintendo 64 was more powerful in theory. With more and more third-party studios bailing on Nintendo, they had to go all in on games. Super Mario 64 revolutionized gaming, allowing Mario to move in 360 degrees of motion. The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time set the standard for storytelling in video games. Meanwhile, a studio called Rare, which Nintendo held a large stake in, also shot out game after game. One of the biggest successes on the Nintendo 64 was the licensed game GoldenEye 007. Rare practically invented the first-person shooter with GoldenEye and sold 8 million copies. Despite immense success with Nintendo and Rare-produced games, Sony simply had more games, period, and the first PlayStation ended up being one of the best-selling consoles ever made. There is so much you could talk about regarding 90s video games. I haven't even touched on the Game Boy, Nintendo's handheld console that made Tetris a household name. I haven't mentioned the rise of Pokemon, or Doom, or Half-Life, or Donkey Kong Country. There's simply too much. Conveniently, that means there's plenty of things to talk about in the collecting department. One of the first pieces of retro hardware I ever got was a Nintendo 64. I was anywhere between 8 and 12. It was during the summer. I'll briefly mention the Wii from 2006 simply because you could buy and download old Nintendo games on it. They were all clearly marked by console, including the NES, Super Nintendo, and N64. I noticed my favorite catalog of classic Nintendo games were all from the 64, and I decided to look into getting one. This would have been around 2013, give or take a few years. I noticed that on the Wii, you could only download Mario Party 2 for the N64. I knew there were definitely more than that because Mario Party 8 is a Wii game, so after a little bit of research, I discovered that the first 3 Mario Party games were in fact released on the Nintendo 64. That left 2 games, 1 and 3, unaccounted for on the Wii, and since 3 is obviously better than 1, I decided I wanted Mario Party 3. After harassing my dad for an unknown amount of time, he caved and ordered me a Nintendo 64 on eBay that summer, along with Mario Kart 64. Not long after, I had Mario Party 3. I could go in a chronological order describing everything I've ever purchased, but it would probably be easier and less confusing to discuss it by era like I've been doing here. Believe it or not, I actually have a Japanese Famicom instead of an American NES, because I wanted to try out the Famicom disk system. One thing about cartridges is that most people threw out the boxes back in the day because the cartridges were sturdy and can be left out on the shelf, but floppy disks are much more fragile and more people held onto the cases. As a result, both games I own for the disk system are complete in-box with their manuals. Those 2 games are The Legend of Zelda and the original Super Mario Bros. 2. Another thing I wasn't able to go into detail over is the fact that there's an American and Japanese Mario 2, and I do in fact have both. Using a simple adapter, you can play American NES cartridges on the Japanese Famicom, and the American Mario 2 is one of the only American cartridges I have for the system. My favorite NES game is probably the American Mario 2. It's a lot different than other Mario games. Instead of stomping enemies and eating mushrooms, you're throwing turnips and flying on carpets. It's a very weird game. My Famicom and my Famicom disk system are the only pieces of Japanese hardware I own. I also have an American Super Nintendo Entertainment System. I got that a few years ago when a friend was in town. We both like collecting retro stuff, and I figured it could be a cool thing to play together. My favorite Super Nintendo game is probably Zelda: A Link to the Past. I'm not very good at Zelda games, but I love exploring the map and stabbing monsters with my trusty sword. Of course, I have a Nintendo 64. I have so many 64 cartridges, I don't even know where to start. According to extremely helpful website vgcollect.com, not sponsored, I have 15 games mostly Nintendo made. My aforementioned out-of-town friend loves hockey, so while he was in town, I went to the retro store and bought NHL 1999. If you can imagine, he kicked my ass. My favorite game on the Nintendo 64 is without a doubt Diddy Kong Racing. I briefly mentioned Rare and I briefly separately mentioned Donkey Kong Country. In the 90s, Rare had been building goodwill with Nintendo and they let Rare pick a franchise and do whatever they wanted with it. Rare chose Donkey Kong and revitalized it for the quote-unquote modern audience, featuring snazzy pseudo 3D graphics and redesigned characters. I say pseudo 3D because this game was on the Super Nintendo and the Super Nintendo was not capable of true 3D. Rare bought expensive supercomputers during development and rendered scans of their character models to be used as 2D character sprites. Here's the best analogy I can come up with. Imagine a movie like Toy Story. They are 3D models, and if you had a Pixar computer, you could look at Buzz Lightyear from any angle. If you're just watching the movie, however, you can only see the final rendered product from the angles they chose, like the camera angles. Rare used this approach to give the Super Nintendo arguably its best-looking game to date, but I digress. Rare became synonymous with Donkey Kong in the 90s, and his new sidekick Diddy got his own spin-off racing game on the Nintendo 64. They went all out in this game, an expertly crafted, beautiful racing game with tight controls and earworm-inducing music. Remember how I said it's harder to find cartridge games with their box because people threw them all out? I went out and hunted a complete in-box copy of Diddy Kong Racing because I knew that if any of my games deserved it, it was Diddy Kong. I don't just have Nintendo, of course. Over the last few years, I've been getting into Sega as well. My first Sega console was their least famous, the Saturn. There's exactly one game I wanted for the Saturn, a realistic racing game called Sega Rally Championship. It's an arcade-style racing game, are you noticing a pattern, where you drive a rally car through rough terrain trying to beat your best time. I did in fact spend $200 on a Sega Saturn for one short racing game, and I have zero regrets. I also have several PlayStation games, but I don't actually own an original PlayStation. Why is that? Because I have every other PlayStation, of course. We're still only in the 90s in this series, but next time I'll be discussing the PS2 and beyond. And fun fact, the PlayStation 2 and 3 can both play original PlayStation discs. Naturally, I play all of my PS1 games on the PS3 because the PS3 has no games. That'll make sense next time, don't worry. I don't have a lot of PS1 games because a lot of them are either easier to find or more convenient to play elsewhere, like on the Nintendo 64 or the Sega Saturn. However, I do cherish one game, Crash Team Racing. Are you noticing a pattern? Crash Team Racing is very similar to Diddy Kong Racing, although it's not as tight to control and you play as Crash Bandicoot instead. Regarding stuff I own, there's not much else to talk about in the 90s. I have a Game Boy Color, and my favorite game on that is probably Wario Land, which is actually just an original Game Boy game. The Color didn't have a whole lot of exclusives because its main selling point was pretty much just being a Game Boy in color. I do have pretty much every Sega system except for the original Master System. I have the Sega CD and the Sega 32X, and they're honestly not that bad. They were definitely too expensive to justify, though. The Sega 32X cost $160 in 1994, and you needed an almost $200 Genesis to use it. I would love an Atari Jaguar, but that stupid thing costs like $500 these days, and I can't justify spending that kind of money on something I'll touch maybe once a year. A lot of people collect simply to have things, but I generally only buy stuff I intend to use. It's why I'll never get a Virtual Boy. Maybe one day I'll get the Jaguar. I actually have a copy of Cybermorph for Jaguar because I found it online for like $10. If I ever get the Jaguar, I'll at least have something to play. Ladies and gentlemen, that's all for today's episode of Connor Collects. Next time on the show, I'll discuss the monstrous introduction of the PlayStation 2, the fall of Sega, the rise of the Xbox, and the last straw for Nintendo. I will also be discussing the second major console war, that being the epic battle between the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3. Thank you all so much for tuning in, and please be sure to rate and subscribe if you want more. Have a great one.